Hi everyone, I'm Gordon Burkell from Filmmaker U. At filmmakeru.com, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify their skill set. Every week we go live at Friday at 2 p.m. with film professionals to chat about what they're doing and how they approach their craft, but more importantly, it gives you an option to ask questions. Today we're going to be joined by Ron Moore, creator of For All Mankind, and Michael O'Halloran, one of the editors for the show. Hi Ron and Michael, welcome to filmmakeru.com.
Hi, thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, I guess one of the questions I was asking Mike before you got on, Ron, was how much did you guys do in CG and how much did you actually have real there? Like was the lander real? It was what was, I guess, practical versus CG?
It really depended on what the scene was. I mean, the LIB, the lunar module, we built practically the lower part, the descent stage, with the ladder and the legs, right, and the engine underneath. And then we had a sizable footprint of moonscape on the sound stage as well. And the moonscape was ever changing. Dan Bishop, our production director, pretty much kept going in and moving rocks and changing elevations and all that. But the top of the lander and all the landscape and sometimes the visors themselves were digital, and it really depended on the scene. But there's a fair amount of complicated work back and forth, especially when astronauts were moving about on the surface. They were on wires, they'd stunt people, and then we would comp that into various landscapes. But there was always some kind of practical element with it. Probably the only pure CG scenes in the show are the exteriors of spaceships and so on. But even then, like at the end, in the latter episodes of season 1, there was a whole sequence where we had astronauts doing an EVA on the spacecraft that had an accident. And that was, again, a combination of live actors on the soundstage being held up with wires and a piece of the spacecraft exterior that we built. And then that was all brought into the CG world.
Now, one of the things, so as soon as I sort of announced that we were going to be interviewing you guys, one of the first things that happened was I got a direct message from someone who worked on the show, and they said, A, they said you guys are great to work with, but B, more importantly, they said that Ron, you have a very unique, I guess you have a very focused attention on, or you focus on details that most people will miss, I guess is the best way to say it.
Oh.
And so just little details in, everything from like the equipment that's used, making sure that it's correct. So
my attention is also known as obsession.
Yes,
well, is that unhealthy attention? Yeah, I mean, I grew up as a fan and aficionado of the space program. So even as I'm old enough to have seen Neil Armstrong walk on the moon as a little kid, and then through the 70s, I was obsessed with NASA, and I wrote letters to them, and they sent me things back and photos, and I read lots of books and pamphlets and stuff. So I really kind of geek out on all the specific equipment and what NASA really did and what they were really capable of and how the equipment functioned and how it worked. And down through the years, I'd always sort of been, annoyed when I would see other depictions of the space program that I was like, that's not how it really worked, or that's not accurate, or this or that. So I sent out the word to all the departments to obsess about the details like I did. And of course, then in post-production, that comes around and bites you in the ass on occasion, because then the technical guys, you're watching cuts, and Mikey and I are like then going through the tech notes, and it's like, oh yeah, there's the valve is turned the wrong way on somebody's spacesuit, and this is not right, and that dial. And so you end up then spending all this money in post-production to fix these little digital details. But at certain points, I just go, okay, this was on me. I asked for this kind of trouble, but even I'm saying, okay, we're not going to correct that. And some things you just learn to live with. But I do like being as close to authentic as we can manage.
So how awesome was it to see the lunar lander in your space? Like, because essentially you had, a replica.
Oh, it was great. It was amazing, to go down there and stand next to the lander. And when you stand next to it, you're really struck by how large a vehicle it really is. I mean, it's a tower. We didn't even have the top of it. And just the descent stage is a towering piece of equipment. By contrast, when you go inside the spacecraft, because we had complete, actual replicas of the command module and the lunar module. And when you would get inside them, they were so small and very claustrophobic. And the walls, the real ones, the walls, the metal was very thin. Somebody famously said that you could poke a screwdriver through the skin of the limb. You know, it was that because all the metal was, they tried to save weight as best they could. So everything was, you know, reduced to bare minimum metal tolerances for everything. And when you would get inside the command module, it was tiny. I mean, it is like being in a sedan, you know, just like a car, you know, crammed with equipment, very few windows, and then you put a spacesuit on, and then for our purposes, put a camera in there, and it's super cramped. Some of the actors were like, whoa, they had moments of claustrophobia being, you know, shot inside some of these things. But it was a thrill. It was really a kick to be able to go down and walk around that stuff that I had grown up with, and, you know, always dreamed about and fantasized about actually getting to do.
Now, as a team here, how do you guys work together? Because Ron, you're one of you're one of the creators, but you're also one of the writers for this. And editing, Mike, has always been referred to as the final rewrite. So how would you guys describe your relationship as a team to bring this to the screen?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. Ron always calls the editing process his final draft. He says the one he writes on paper is the first, the one they direct is the second, and the final draft is what we do in the edit room. The Ron's process is, I mean, all showrunners have a different process in my experience. Ron likes to come in, we watch the show together. We don't stop, which is nice. A lot of people stop as we go. So Ron gets to take in the full thing. And then we go back and we start doing, you know, notes. Where again, I don't usually do them in front of you, Ron, the first time. They're broader notes, you know, structural notes, lifts, stuff, you know, maybe like something like, oh, can we make the performance from this particular actor, you know, a little more comical, less, you know, angry or something like that. And then I'll take a few days, and sometimes a little longer, depending on how many notes. And Ron will come back, we'll show it to you again. Then we get into the weeds a bit more. We start looking at, you know, certain performances and a lot more of the visual effects stuff, and fixing a lot of things like Ron described, the technical stuff. The one we're concentrating a lot on now is there's a patch on one of the uniforms. That's I couldn't tell the difference at first, but it is slightly off, Ron, right? And we're now digitally fixing this patch.
There were a set of wings, like some of the astronauts were naval aviators, and they have a specific set of wings that they wear on their flight suits, and we had the wrong one on the day, and then didn't catch it for a long time, so we had to go back in and digitally repair and put in the different wings on their costume.
Now, when you guys get together and start working, how much change do you sort of put into each episode? Because yesterday I interviewed some doc editors, and it changes on a daily basis. You know, like, okay, maybe we'll go with this storyline, but you guys are a little more structured by the script. So were there a lot of changes in the post process? Like, how did you sort of come to your final decisions?
It really varies by the episode. Some episodes are just strong, you know, from the first cut, and all you're really doing is looking to lift time or polish performances. Lifting time is like a big thing in television. We're always over, and you're always trying to get the show back to its fighting weight, at least on a streaming service or on something like Outlander for Stars. There's a specific runtime you're trying to hit. So first pass, in fact, before we play the episode, I always say, so where are we in terms of time? Because that's like the first thought I have to deal with, is trying to get it to the correct runtime. And then there are some episodes that are just problematic for whatever reason. You know, so a lot of times the script wasn't structured right, or there were problems in shooting, or, you know, a variety of reasons. You're watching an episode and I'm going, oh my God, this doesn't work. It doesn't hang together. It's not paced correctly. The rhythm isn't working. Sometimes the story itself is really a problem, and wow, what do we do with it now? And in those circumstances, then it's, you know, I'll watch the first cut and we'll just talk about it frankly at the end, like, wow, okay, we're going to have to like rework this whole thing. And you start pulling out various editorial tricks. Okay, can we change it's a linear episode, let's make it a non-linear episode. Let's put the end at the beginning and do flashback structures. Let's start mixing up storylines. Let's take the A story and make it the B story. And you just start playing around with ideas until you usually find some version that starts to, gather steam, and you're like, okay, I think we're finally onto something on this episode. And then you just have to kind of really sit on it and bear down and then keep going. I mean, there have been episodes where we've gone all the way back to dailies, or had Mikey go, I don't go to dailies. Mikey's gone all the way back to dailies and kind of reassembled the show as part of the process. Fortunately, that's not usually the usual thing. Usually the episodes are in pretty good shape, and you're just trying to like figure out kinks in storylines here and there.
They're the most challenging, but they're also the most satisfying in the end, aren't they, Ron? As far as on a personal level, you're just like, wow, we cracked that one.
Yeah, like that in Outlander, when we did the wedding show first season, the wedding was like a big thing, because it was obvious, it's a wedding in any television show where you're marrying the principals. That's a landmark event. And it was a big part of the book, and the fans were going to be excited about it. It was a big promo piece. And so we watched the first cut, and it was like, oh, this isn't playing. It just wasn't quite put together right. The director had done a great job. He directed a lot of good stuff, but the cut itself just didn't live. And some of it was structural in the script, and some of it, there's just, there's always a variety of reasons. And then Mikey and I think, were you in the US and I was in Scotland?
Yeah, I flew over to Scotland to work with you on that one. And we spent a good 2 weeks. I mean, we just completely ripped it apart and started from scratch. And I think in the end, that's like one of the fan favorites now, right?
Yeah, and we pulled out all the stops on that one. And we were doing tricks like running footage backwards to get the right head turn, and flopping images and stealing stuff from in between takes and everything. But at the end, it was very satisfying, because it was a really good episode, and you felt a tremendous sense of accomplishment, that the material was there, the story was there, it was all there, and you just had to carve the stone and let the statue come out.
Wow. Now, one of the things I noticed in the story, it's more about following the program almost, as opposed to like, here's the main character and we just follow them episode to episode. So what were some of the sort of hills you had to climb to get that to work, or what were some of the struggles that you had to overcome to make that flow from episode to episode? Because that was, I don't want to give away anything, so I'm kind of nervous about saying the wrong thing here, but like, I felt following the women for a couple episodes was phenomenal. Like, I just love that storyline, and then we move on right to the next sort of episode part of the thing. So how do you guys, what did you overcome there?
It's interesting. I mean, it was something we talked about in the writer's room early on, because the nature of the show was to start moving through time rather aggressively. Even in season 1, we start in June of 1969, and by the end of season 1, we're in 1974. So you're moving through years, and then the series overall, at the end of season 1, we jump to 1983 for season 2, and so on. Like every year, every season, we're going to keep jumping more or less 10 years. So you start looking at it in a different way, because if you get too focused on specific characters, well, their stories are going to drop off. They're going to die, they're going to age out, and other generations are going to come forward. So right away, the very nature of the show means it is more about the program. Yes, it's a character piece, and you're talking about the characters who live within it, but the macro story is really the story of NASA in an alternate universe and how that would all work. So it was a unique structure, and it took a while for us in the writer's room to kind of figure that out. What is the rhythm of it? How long do you stay with a particular story on a particular point in time? And when you jump ahead by even a couple of years, you pretty much clip off the stories that you've been telling in terms of plot. The character story still is going, and then you're picking up the character at a later point in his or her life. So it's just a very different format. I mean, I started hearkening back to, there was a series called Centennial, a miniseries in the 80s, I believe, that was based on a I think, James Michener novel that I watched as a kid. And I loved it. I was fascinated with it. It was one of those big, epic, I don't know how many 12-hour, miniseries back in the day when they did miniseries like that. But it told the story of a town called Centennial, Colorado. And it literally starts with the formation of the earth. And then the Native Americans come, and then there's stories with them. And then French trappers, and then the first settlers, and it basically goes all the way through the generations up until the 1980s. And there was something really interesting about it, watching television like that, where you would get invested in certain characters and then watch them as young, grow old, have children, then they would die, and then their children would carry on the story, and their grandchildren, and there was these overlapping character arcs all the way through it. So that kind of influenced me, and we talked about it a lot in the writer's room, because that was essentially the style of show that we're telling here, where we're moving through generationally, not through centuries like Centennial did, but even through decades. It's still a similar kind of storytelling.
Oh, now, because this is sort of I guess like an alternate universe, as you mentioned, we still have real people in the show, like people based on real people. And so I'm wondering, where do you, as a creator, draw the line in terms of making up fiction of the character? Like, where's that sort of, here's what the person was really like, here's where I sort of take liberties with character. Like when I saw John Glenn come in, I was like, did he actually say that? And I had to like look it up online. I'm like, oh my gosh, he actually felt that way about women. So I'm wondering where that line is as you're creating something like this, because you want to have that freedom, but
Yeah, it's a fine line. I mean, it was one of the first things we tackled was how many real life historical figures would we have in the show and how to portray them. And then you get involved in legal affairs and all that kind of stuff. There's all kinds of legal issues associated with it too. But on a creative level, we just kind of took the point of view early on that essentially we were going to be fair to these people. John Glenn really did feel that way, and it's documented, and he said it on camera, and that was just something he said, and something he really felt. With a character like Deke Slayton, who's in the show, was a main character in the show over many episodes, he clearly didn't do any of the things he did in our series, but we tried to make it true to the spirit of who Deke was. And we tried to be, embrace him for a man of his time and what his attitudes would be, and sort of the father figure of the astronaut corps and things like that. Same with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and anybody who was real. We tried to make them close to who we understood them to be historically. Werner von Braun is a more complicated choice, because his backstory in Nazi Germany and building the V2 and his relationship with the concentration camp and the labor camp nearby is a complicated one that most people weren't familiar with, because it wasn't talked about over the span of his lifetime for the most part after the end of the war. But it was true, and it did come out. There was a book called Operation Paperclip, which we relied on, and there were other documented things like his army interrogations. And what we tried to say was, here's what the historical facts are in that hearing room. And then here's what we know Werner said himself about his experience that he didn't know. And he always kind of slid around exactly what he did know and what he didn't see. And he always maintained he didn't really know, and that, he was promoted in the SS, wasn't really his choice. And then we kind of left it to the viewers to decide how they wanted to feel about that, and to kind of play it like that. So we tried to be as fair as we could to Werner, while acknowledging sort of the historical truth of what was there.
Now, what would you guys say was the toughest scene for you guys to work on in the scene, or toughest scene in terms of most challenging for you guys?
Well, there's scenes that are technically challenging, and then there are ones that are just not working dramatically sometimes, and they're very different in that way. There's a lot of the green screen stuff can be, well, I'll tell you which one it is, Ron. The one where in season 1, the episode you wrote, the High Bob, where the helmets weren't connected.
Oh my God.
and they had to digitally, something happened on set while they were shooting, and early in the day, they decided, all right, well, just don't worry about that. The helmets, they're not connected to the suit. So we had to digitally go in, and that's a lot of screen time. I mean, 10, 15 minutes worth, right? Of every shot.
It was a huge scene, and it was a pivotal scene in the show. And there were a variety of reasons. If something happened on the day on the set, I'm sure it's all about time and, trying to make your day. But there was also the choice was made at the time not to shoot it with a visor, which is something we kind of go back and forth with. The visual effects supervisor on the day will usually say, on this shot, in this angle, we want the glass visor, and in this one we don't, we'll put it in later. In this particular scene, they shot the whole thing without the visor. and there's this bar or this piece of costume or spacesuit that goes around that connects to the top of the helmet that then got folded in because the visor wasn't there to hold it out. So when you tried to put a digital visor in front of it, this bottom piece didn't match up anymore. So then you had to recreate the bottom piece, and then you had to worry about the light spill under this. It was this whole thing. So as a result, technically, it was so expensive to literally do it in every single shot that Mikey and I had to go in and recut it to try to de-emphasize as much as we could the problems. And it did force us to some creative choices. Like we got inside the helmets a few times. We just pushed in under the footage, got inside the helmet to avoid having to do this whole repair work, and then kind of put a little bit of a color over them, like gold or something, to kind of give it a certain look and feel. Said feeling like you were inside the helmet for the first time, and it was actually kind of effective. It worked pretty well in the cut, but the whole scene had to be recut so that we, the trick in visual effects is usually the longer the take is, the cheaper it is. Whereas if you have multiple takes of visual effects, it's much more expensive, almost exponentially. So Mikey and I then had to figure out what shots we could hold for a longer period, which takes we could hold for a longer time, how long we could, how long we could sit in the 2-shot, and how long you could hold the close up. And it just suddenly the technical budgetary aspects were driving the creative, which is always a pain in the ass. But we did manage to still make it a good scene.
And it kills you because you want to be spending that money on big, expensive CG, space moonshots, and to have to sacrifice some of the budget for that is very frustrating.
Well, that's one of the technical ones. Was there a particular story element that was, and I don't mean like the story wasn't working, but getting it to sort of click a bit better, or getting it to punch up a bit?
In the pilot, didn't we have, the first episode, Ron, didn't we go back and forth a bunch with making the astronauts a little more fun and likable? They were kind of too down and depressed about losing the moon. So we recut a bunch of scenes to emphasize that they weren't as depressed or down about it. And that was a challenge. I think we even had to pick up a few shots to make that.
We picked up. We did some reshoots. We picked up a few things. Trying to like it was just the way I wrote it. I mean, I wrote it that they were hit by the Russians beating them to the moon, and they took it very hard. But they took it so hard in the initial cut that it was just like a really depressing piece for a very long time. So we had to find lighter moments. We had to pick up some footage and even some sequences.
The bar where they throw the bottles at the dartboard. That was the section we reshot where they
reshot that
and,
completely.
Yeah, the singing wasn't part of the initial.
The
version they shot first. It was just them kind of sitting around the bar, depressed and whining about it a little bit.
A lot of times you're just struggling with the scene creatively because it's not hitting the right note, and then inevitably you're.
Nope.
A piece of coverage you need. You want to a character's reaction on a very important moment, or to sell. You realize they weren't looking in the right direction, or that there's no coverage that does that. It was just in a wider shot, and so there's a lot of creative things that are struggles, just somewhat technically, because you don't have the technical pieces to tell the story that way. Or sometimes I'm changing my mind about what that scene is about. The intention was it's about this, and I think it's more effective if we emphasize this other character, make it her story instead of his story, emphasize that. But how do we make that work? Because the footage wasn't designed to fit together that way. So it's a lot of puzzle, taking things apart and trying to put them back together in different structures that we spend our time on.
And off that, Ron, sometimes you'll notice something that you didn't expect in a good way, that from the performance or whatever, and then you'll change it because you want to emphasize something that the director or the actor brought to the scene that you weren't expecting. And we'll, redo scenes for that reason sometimes.
Yeah, that's great. Sometimes you're like, wow, look at that. What we just did over there. Let's try to make it all about that. That's that's where the story is.
That happens quite a bit, actually.
Does it?
Yeah, not quite, enough though.
Well, now, in terms of tone, because you sort of hinted at that, you might want to shift the sort of perspective, and the tone in a scene requires so many departments, and of course, editing being one of them, and making sure that the tone of the scene works. So I'm wondering, Ron, from the script writing phase to the editor with Mike, how do you guys work to sort of mold the tone and get it right?
It's kind of intuitive, you're just watching the cut, and I'm just at the end of it, I'm usually just talking about my feelings. I'm feeling it's too slow, or it's too fast, and we're not the emotions are not registering, or it's too bombastic and we haven't earned it, or the humor isn't working. We should cut those jokes because the jokes are just laying there. And it's just usually a very intuitive kind of, subjective point of view as I'm watching it. And then as Mikey and I really dig into it, and he starts playing with music's incredibly important in the process. And as Mikey starts laying in
I think
the mood of the whole episode.
Sorry, you broke up there a bit at the music part.
Oh, I was just saying I was just saying it's very important because it changes everything. And as Mikey's trying out different pieces of score or songs, it changes everything about the scene. It changes the mood of the whole episode. I always talk about episodes generally as being music. They have bass and melodies, and they have tempos and high points and crescendos, and all. It's very musical kind of composition in my head, at least. So as I'm watching, I'm always talking about the rhythm of the show. We need to slow down the show right here. We need to pick up the pace right here. We need to build to a climax. And one of the most important things of all, when you're just looking at it, overall, is to figure out where the show's over. Because sometimes we write too much, like we've missed the dramatic ending of a particular story, and it's like that's the end of the story, and everything else we have to cut. And people are sometimes shocked, especially the original writer might be horrified that I'm cutting the rest of that scene, or cutting scenes that went after it. But truth is, the show is over right then, and you have to kind of know that intuitively and say that's the end of the show. And so then you can almost backfill in, well, the climax of the show is here, and then there's high points and low points and places where you need some quiet before it explodes again. And it's all about rhythm and pace in a lot of ways.
How about yourself, Mike? How do
I
you
would say
tackle
Ron has really great instinct about the tone, and we've been working together so many years now that I'm going to have very similar sensibilities. But even when I'm assembling a scene from the first initial assembly, I'll have sometimes the music playing as I'm doing it. So if I know it's like a scene with a lot of tension, or a lot of action, I'll pick a piece of music. We have all our composers' music, so I often use that because it'll be similar, and I cut it to that beat or pace, which is a really helpful way to do it, I find.
Now, we've got a question from our viewers here, and they said your VFX story with the helmet was a great example of solving a problem. But Aaron is interested in knowing, I'm curious if any lessons over the years from Star Trek to now, where a decision was made just to solve a problem versus a story one. Is there any ones that had to be solved for just tech reasons that you look back on?
I'm not sure.
Sorry, he's wondering. So he was asking if. So you had the story where it clicks closed,
right.
And that's based on story because they're in space. But he's wondering if there's any that you made just for technical reasons that you personally were like, I want to fix that. And
there's lots of errors, and there's things that end up in shots that you need to fix, and people say the wrong thing, and we have to go fix it in ADR reasons. There's all kinds of garden variety errors that just occur on any production that's shooting. And then sometimes there are things that are just genuinely wrong, and that sometimes I didn't catch at the story stage, and I'm watching it in editorial and going, oh my God, did he just say that? That totally is wrong. That's so wrong. That just contradicts what we're doing. Oh my God. Now I've got to reconstruct this scene, and we've got to reshoot this, or I've got to, a variety of things. It could be anything. Sometimes, I wasn't there, or sometimes, there was an episode in Battlestar Black Market, which I did a whole podcast about that episode that started off saying, okay, today we're going to talk about an episode that didn't work very well. And when I saw the first cut of it, I hated it. And I was like so mortified. I walked outside and smoked a cigarette. And I was just like, what the hell am I going to do about this? And went in and did the trick I talked about earlier, was I took the ending and put it at the beginning and made the whole show a flashback as a Band-Aid to at least give it some tension. but it was what it was, and there was not much I could really do to salvage the show, because the truth was the problems were in the script, and I didn't see them in the script, and I wasn't there during production to kind of see. So I'd kind of walked away from a lot of aspects of that particular episode, and then it bit me in the ass, and it was like, okay, now we got to figure out what to do with this, and we're stuck. But technical things are always happening. Everything from doors that don't close, or wrong thing looking out the window. So a lot of times screen direction is wrong. The characters are looking in the wrong places. Mikey's a wizard at fixing eye lines. I don't know how much, probably 30% of his time must be spent fixing eye lines, and actors are not actually looking at what they're supposed to be looking at. And there's constantly cheating and using split screens to marry performances together. And there's all kinds of things.
We had a good one the other day. I was fixing that. I guess it somehow slipped through the cracks in the script, and one of the characters kept being referred to as captain instead of admiral. So I had to, or vice versa, I had to go back and play all that on the character's back so they could fit in the word captain instead of admiral. And yeah.
What now? Someone else here is wanting to know, because you guys talked about screening the cuts, and and they want to know if you guys have any tricks to staying objective after, or I guess staying fresh, because Ron, you've been going with this since the script phase, and Mikey, you've been spending hours with the footage. So how do you stay fresh and objective while watching the footage?
I think it's a little more difficult for me because I'm watching it. I'll watch it 100, 200 times sometimes, and one day I'll watch it and be like, oh my God, this is great. It's working perfectly. And the next day I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh, none of this works. So it's great to have Ron come in and say, no, calm down. That's all great. No, that's not a problem. This is a problem, but that is not a problem you're obsessing over. So that does help to have someone who hasn't watched it hundreds of times, has only seen it 30 times, come in and
yeah, and for me, there's a point when there's a point in the life of the show where I kind of don't watch dailies anymore. I have creative producers and other producers that are watching. They're literally there on the set, and then they watch dailies. And sometimes I'll catch up, and late at night I'll just start scanning through dailies obsessively and like watching tons of them. And it's 3 o'clock in the morning before I know it. But by and large, I haven't seen the show in a while. By the time I sit in the editing bay, the script is weeks ago. The production shoot is quite a while ago still, and I haven't seen most of the dailies. And so it's kind of a fresh experience. When I sit down, a lot of times it's like, oh yeah, what's in this? I don't even remember what's in this episode. It's kind of like a very pure experience, and I can be objective, or actually I shouldn't be objective. You need to be subjective. I have to sort of go by how it affects me. What's my take on it? Do I feel good about it? Am I unhappy with it? Did it make me laugh? Did it make me cry? What do I want to feel here? And then go with that. And then the longer, now I'm into say it's a problematic episode, like the wedding show, and we're looking at the footage over and over again. There does become a point where you're not quite sure anymore, because you watch this so many times that the fear is it bad and I don't see it? Because I've gotten used to this cut, and I've gotten used to the way that this is playing, and I like it, but am I just used to it, or do I genuinely like it? And so you do, at a certain point, have to open it up to other people who then give you their notes, and you ignore most of them and go with your instinct anyway. But you try to hear the notes, and you try to
because sometimes there's even scenes that were real problematic, and then we finally get them to work just on a level where it tracks and makes sense, and we're so satisfied, but then we realize, oh, but is it any good dramatically?
Does it work dramatically? That's the killer. It's like sometimes we've worked on scenes for a very long time, and then we cut them in the end. It's just like, fine. That was just it.
Right.
Now we have another question that's come in, and they want to know in the show, how much does the story change from script to edit, or to final edit?
It depends on the episode. Some of them, like Ron said earlier, are pretty smooth, and
really
we stick to the script is almost exactly how it's scripted. And then others, like the wedding episode, or there's a handful of other ones that are, you wouldn't recognize them from the original script if you read it, while you're watching. You're like, huh?
Yeah.
You wouldn't even be able to follow.
Yeah, it'd be hard to even track it through the script, because we've jumbled up the storytelling and really changed the way things are playing.
Wow. Now I have one last question that I like to ask everyone I interview, and that's, what would you say is your guilty pleasure film or show to watch?
There's so many. I'm currently watching, which I'm loving, is The Great on Hulu. The satirical Catherine the Great drama. It's really funny.
Is it good?
It's fantastic. But yeah. What about you,
Roadhouse? Yeah, Roadhouse is a favorite.
Is great.
If it's on, I'm watching it. You know, it's kind of the definition of guilty pleasure.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic.
Showgirls is another one.
Showgirls, always a favorite.
Now, someone is actually just slipping in a question here just before we go, so I hope you guys are okay with answering one more question. It's a very long question. So this is from Kylie. She says, I started rewatching Battlestar Galactica recently, and I realized that the 1 year later jump didn't hit nearly the same way. I lost my freaking mind for the first time. And that it didn't hit the same way at the end either, at the season for All Mankind either. So she's watched it a couple times. It's remarkable how a device like that felt like a big risk, and now it's becoming more and more common. Do you feel the same way? And if so, has the way we watch and experience stories changed so that the risks can be bigger in the storytelling? So I guess are people becoming more media savvy in this?
Oh, definitely. I mean, we're consuming a lot more media than we ever have in history. So you start seeing a lot more, and you start getting familiar with the tricks of the trade, and you start getting familiar with devices. When we did the year jump forward on Galactica, it was fairly unprecedented. I don't know that another TV show certainly had never done that, and just jumped a year in the story, in the middle of an episode of all things. And so it shocked people, and it made an impression. And then other people started to do it. And then, it becomes then a storytelling device. And you see it a few times in other shows. It's not quite as shocking. So it doesn't surprise me to go back to the original. It's not going to have nearly the same impact the second time around. But that's great. I mean, I'm kind of always been very proud of that and flattered by the fact that people start to do that in other storytelling. But yeah, we're a very media savvy people. And we're very narrative savvy. We're taught the 3-act structure in nursery school, beginning, middle, and end, and nursery rhymes and nursery tales. And we get 3 acts. We get the concept of narrative structure in the crib. And so we consume so much of it over the course of our lifetimes that it's hard to trick the audience now. It's hard to find a different way to do this. But we always do. And people keep coming up with new ways of telling stories and devices and narrative tricks that people haven't seen, and that keeps it fresh. And anytime you can tell the audience you're going down this path and make them feel comfortable, like, oh, I know what's going to happen. He's going to do that, and she's going to do that, and they kind of sit back and they kind of, their guard drops. And if you can then change it all of a sudden, and it's over here. Oh, he didn't do that. She went this other direction. Then the audience is sort of on their toes, and almost anything can happen. It's like Game of Thrones when they. I guess I won't spoil Game of Thrones, but in season 1, they kill a major character, halfway through the season or 2/3 of the way through the season. And it's the last character that you would think would die at all in an ongoing television series. And once they did that, all bets were off on the narrative. And you were like, oh my God, these people are crazy. They're capable of anything. And that's gold. As a storyteller, that's gold when you got forward, because you're going to do next, because you've proven to them that you will do something to surprise them. That's narrative gold, and I think all of us are always seeking that as we're telling stories.
It's so funny that you would say that, because one of the things I always tell my wife is that when I fall in love with a show, one of the things I do is start guessing where the story's going. And that's what I loved about the show, is because I was like, oh, they're going to go down this road, or this is going to happen. And then it would completely be wrong, which is the best part. But it's so much fun. Now we have one last question. And did you have any different constraints while working for a streaming service like Apple? What were some of the differences?
We didn't really run into many, in all honesty, because partly because of the nature of the show. The nature of our show didn't have a lot of graphic content or extreme violence or sexuality, or that just wasn't part of what we were doing. So it wasn't like I was bumping into restrictions from the service at all. I mean, they basically supported us, and they basically, it's a risky show. It's an unusual structure. It is about a program instead of people. It's an alternate history, so it requires a certain knowledge of history. It's challenging the audience in a lot of ways. And Apple was willing to sort of go for it and support us in doing that. And I give them an enormous amount of credit for that. So I didn't find it, a difficult experience at all.
And one of the other constraints you didn't have is the time. We weren't stuck to a very specific time, which is always the biggest challenge.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much for letting me talk with you guys and letting people ask their questions. So they can catch your show. I was going to say, what time could they catch your show? But I guess, go to Apple Plus TV and check out
Apple TV Plus.
Apple TV Plus.
You can go there right now on your browser. Just switch over, go to Apple TV Plus. All the episodes are there. You can stream them. You can binge them.
Yeah, exactly. Next week, for those watching, we'll be on Wednesday at 2:30 instead of Friday, because Friday is the long weekend. So join us next Wednesday. We'll be with director Mimi Leader. Thank you very much, guys, and have a